Okay, today I'm going to talk about D.H. Lawrence and his poem Bavarian Gentians. D.H. Lawrence, of course, is one of the major poets in modern English poetry. He was born in 1885 and died in 1930. So he, in fact, occupied a very well distinguished position in at the turn of the century and the very rise of modernism in poetry. Like Hardy before him, Lawrence was born a sick and frail child. He suffered a kind of prolonged inflammation of the lungs, which developed into tuberculosis later on, which finally killed him at a very early age. And this made him live all his life in the haunting imminence of an approaching sense of death. So he developed death as a recurrent theme in most of his poems. In fact, death became a kind of anxiety for him, actually. He was not only a poet, he was also an established novelist, and the kind of novels he wrote were so new, so radical in spirit, so nonconformist, that they, in fact, brought onto him a great deal of castigation and persecution from the church, which imposed a ban on most of his novels, especially the first novel, Lady Chatterley's Lover, because they considered him as they said, a spoiler of a whole generation, and they called for burning his novels. The fact which actually caused a great deal of distress for Lawrence, because he was not able to get any of his work published, and he suffered a great deal from that crisis. The reason for this was his novels, in fact, were so daring that they exposed certain taboo themes and taboo subjects in Victorian life. Victorian England was full of abuses, full of corruption, full of, in fact, poverty. And Lawrence is one of those writers who did not flatter the Queen, did not flatter the dogma, all sorts of dogma. Rather, he exposed the actual life of people as it is, and he lashed severely at some of these abuses on the one hand. On the other hand, he brought a new taste into modern literary life, and he preached a new belief in the supremacy of the instinct, feeling, or intuition as the best guide for man in life and in literary matters. He followed the example of Walt Whitman and Blake, that whatever lives is holy, and he emphasized the importance of the psychological primeval drives and appetites inside man, and he considered any repression of these needs as, in fact, as leading to a kind of unhealthy personality, because he said it will cause what is called in psychology maladjustment. social maladjustment. So this is what is wrong with modern society. In modern society, he believes we have too much of rationalism. Modern man has gone to extremes in rationalizing his life. And this too much of rationalization, too much of facts, too much of ideas at the expense of feeling, he believes has led to deadening man's imagination, sterilizing his thought, and in fact blunting his spirit. Man, he said, became like a mechanical robot, or unable to feel, unable to commune with nature, unable to derive any sort of solace or fulfillment from love or from friendship. Because even these matters of the heart, like love and friendship, he believes, they have been subjected to material and financial and rational principles. And hence they stop short of giving a man any solace or any real satisfaction. Modern man, he said, is suffocates due to the many taboos and many restrictions and many manacles which are imposed on his spirit and on his life. And this led to an unhealthy psychological life, frustration and maladjustment, as we said. But this is the message that he wanted to convey. Lawrence was not trying to spoil the whole generation as the Christian church believed. He was only maybe trying to awaken man into the significance of natural feeling, of intuition, and to try to restore to man's life some of the vigor and of the vitality which it has lost. He established therefore a new principle in modern, and he revived the romantic principle of feeling and intuition, and he established a trend which was followed by many poets after him, like both in Europe and in America, like for example the Beats or the Beatniks, a group of poets who dominated the 60s, like we have Allen Ginsberg, and led by Allen Ginsberg, and his masterpiece Howl, of course. Lawrence was the main inspiring force for these poets. We may mention here also Teddy Hughes and his wife Sylvia Plath. So, to convey this theme, Lawrence believes that the traditional rules of prosody and the traditional forms of poetry are no longer valid, in fact. So he used a new form of poetry, which is free verse. And sometimes he even writes, he goes to extremes in freeing poetry and in emancipating poetry from the rules of traditional prosody by writing prose poetry and not only free verse. Of course, some people believe that writing a prose poem is something easy and that we all can write a prose poem. On the contrary, in fact, writing a prose poem is something which is more difficult than writing a traditional poem like classical poem. And this is very well known, of course. If you compare a prose poem by Al-Sayyab, for example, with a classic or a free verse poem by Al-Sayyab with a classical piece written by Al-Mutanabbi, for example, you will see the difference between the two. Lawrence favored the latter form. I mean, he favored free verse and the prose poetry because he said they are more functional to uh, to embodying the flux of feeling. Free verse and prose poetry, he believes, they are more functional to achieve this utmost fidelity to the flux of feeling. Imposing cliched rules on feeling will curb this feeling and will lead into the artificiality of feeling, as he believes. So this sense of renewal, this in life, in natural life, and this flux of feeling, consciousness, in fact, it cannot be rendered into the traditional forms, and it needs such a new form to be fully rendered, as I said. Again, writing a free verse poem or a prose poem is not something easy here, because the writer must pour or must instill in the poem a great intensity of feeling or emotion to compensate for the lack of rhyme and rhythm here. Because poetry, as you know, is not only rhyme and rhythm. What is more important than rhyme and rhythm is the intensity, the genuinity of feeling. And there is a great deal of this in Lawrence's poetry. Lawrence is also distinguished what differentiates him from other poets was his insight, the deep insight he had into the life of animals and flowers, trees, and nature in general. He has a group of poems which are called the bestiaries, in which he covered a wide range of animals and animal life, natural life in his poetry, and he showed a surprising insight into the inner life of these animals, the consciousness of these animals. He doesn't portray these animals from the outside. He doesn't only give us a picture or a portrait of these animals from the outside, like the picture we saw in the Windhover, for example, or in the Darkening Thrush. Lawrence emphasizes the inner life of these animals, the way they feel and the way they respond and the way they interact with man or with nature. And even the meanest of animals and the most insignificant of animal life and natural life, in fact, was included by Lawrence in some of his poems. If we mention something about his autobiography here, Lawrence suffered in his life a kind of conflict between his father and his mother, because they were inherently different. His father was a miner belonging to the proletariat or the working class, while his mother was a school teacher belonging to the middle class, with its emphasis on thoughts, religion, and ideas, while the father was a kind of instinctive man. Sometimes he is even vulgar and sensuous, unlike the mother, in fact. That conflict caused a split in the ego of the sons, especially Lawrence himself. And in this conflict, the mother proved the most powerful, and hence Lawrence developed a kind of edible attachment of fixation on his mother, as he admitted this later on. He was introduced to Frida van Richthofen the daughter of a German officer, garrison officer, and after she eloped, the two were married in Europe, and this again caused Lawrence a great deal of persecution because because of the German origin of his wife, and also because he opposed the British policies in the First World War, and he was eventually, in fact, accused of being a spy for the Germans. To the end of his life, he suffered a great deal of poverty, political persecution, and his health also sank, poor health. Therefore, he left England never to return, and he spent the last part of his life making towers into Europe, into Africa, into Latin America, and that those fabulous, remote, sometimes tropical atmospheres provided the raw material for some of his late poetry. Died in 1930 of tuberculosis, as I said, and he ordered for a picture of the phoenix to be inscribed on his grave. The phoenix, that mythic bird which lives for thousands of years in the desert of Arabia, and when it grows very old and gaunt and lifeless. It burns itself, and then from the ashes we have the rise of small bulbs or new young birds to live another cycle of life. The phoenix, therefore, in Lawrence's poetry, is a symbol for this sense of renewal, this sense of revival in nature. And his attitude to death and the theme of death, which is the central theme in the poem Bavarian Gentians, is to be understood within this perspective. Death here is not seen as something ugly or fearful, but rather he looks at death as necessary for maintaining this machine of life, this sense of rhythmic cadence or renewal in nature. As we have death, as we have life, we must also have death, because the machine of nature, the sense of renewal in nature, depends on this parallel between the two principles, life and death. And this, had it not been for death, then life would have become arid and empty and without meaning. He agrees with one of the modern American poets, Wallace Stevens, who once said that death is the mother of beauty. Death is a harbinger of beauty, a harbinger of change, and the only life that man must hope for on this planet is in change. Man is not born to live eternally. Death is in fact prerequisite of life, and man has to come to terms with this, with death, and he has to understand, to accept death as a necessary part of his life, and as in fact prerequisite for maintaining this sense of renewal and cadence in nature, as I said.